Okay, language thinks. This is part 4, phrases. So quite often students have trouble actually, say, brainstorming a concept. You may give them a concept and you say, all right, now go and brainstorm all the types of violence, for example, and they can really struggle trying to do that. So quite often then we'll go off on a whole bunch of different tangents in order to get them to think about it. But one thing that we often neglect is quite simply using words and using language to help them to generate those ideas. So what we're looking at now is using word combinations to extend their conceptual understanding. So the first one that we're looking at is basically just concept development. And this is what I call stimulating the semantic relationship. So basically it's the idea of taking two words and combining them in order to generate new ideas about or new meanings. So it's pretty simple really, but one thing that's really important in this is that you have to approach it in a particular manner. You have to assume when you do this that all of what you're generating is going to be right. And then you have to prove it, rather than deciding whether or not, yes, this one's right and this one's wrong. Okay, you assume that all of them are right, and that'll make a little more sense in a moment when I get to the example. So pretty much the way this works is the kids work with a partner. They can do it by themselves as well, and they have to make a list of as many classifying adjectives as they can think of. That if they struggle with that, it doesn't hurt to give them a word bank or ask them to go online and make a word bank using some kind of internet search. Just as a pointer, classifying adjectives are ones that can't take a modifying adverb. So that means, for example, that if you were saying vegetarian, you couldn't have a very vegetarian meal, because basically it either is vegetarian or it's not vegetarian. As soon as you take away some of its vegetarianness by adding meat, it's no longer vegetarian. And so what you get them to do is you get them to select a concept, for example, violence, and apply each of those adjectives, and then explain what would count as an example of each of those. So simple concepts are abstract nouns, by the way. So you can see that I've got here a list of classifying adjectives, and my concept is violence. So I'm going to say, well, what is an example of physical violence? Again, this is where you have to assume that it's going to be right. You're not looking at it and going, is it right, is it wrong? You're going, it is right, I have to somehow work out how it's right. So physical violence is a pretty simple one. Basically, one person doing damage to another person, or not necessarily a person, but basically some kind of violence in the physical world. Pretty simple. Okay, but then we get on to the more complex ones, like grammatical violence. So, for example, an example of grammatical violence could be using grammar, using a particular feature of grammar in order to be destructive. So, any kind of persuasive language could effectively be violence. If you're take Hitler, for example. He was very persuasive and he used particular features of grammar in order to persuade people to do some atrocious things. Another type of grammatical violence we could be looking at is the way that we do damage to the grammatical features of a sentence, and in doing that, it no longer works as a sentence. So basically, if somebody is using what we would sometimes say is not appropriate grammar, and it means that that sentence no longer works in terms of being able to communicate an idea, then that becomes a form of violence because it's doing damage to that sentence. Third one, numerical violence. So using numbers to cause violence or to cause damage. Statistics is a great example. Whenever people use statistics in a kind of deceptive way, that's a form of numerical violence. In the same way, if you do something that use some kind of a formula, for example, or even a very large numbers in order to cause some kind of a damage. So in a way, anytime you have a large group of something that ends up leading to damage, that's a form of numerical violence. You go from having a small number, let's just say of locusts, to a large number of locusts. All of a sudden it does damage, it's a plague. So there you've got an example of numerical violence. And lastly, archival violence. So if we take archival as important information being stored, one type of violence to that important information would be, basically destroying it or corrupting it or doing something so that it can no longer be retrieved. Another type of archival violence could be sort of what we see in different versions of history. So whenever somebody uses um, archives or um, primary sources in a particularly deceptive way, maybe perhaps they only use part of the primary source, or they use it, or they interpret it in a particular way, and they're then using that to cause damage to a particular set of beliefs, for example. That would be an example of archival violence. So hopefully in this one you can see the way that what we've done is we've just taken a bunch of words, we've put them together, and then we've used those to develop some kind of conceptual understanding. And again, it's very simple, and it's something that once kids get the hang of, they can do it quite easily and quite quickly.